Welcome to my video on context and language change. This will take you from early modern English to present day English, and it will cover all the contextual factors that might affect a text and that you might want to bring in when you're analysing it. Now, I said my video, but I'd like to say a big thank you to Evie, Destiny, Scarlett and Spooks for helping out by doing the visuals and putting the slides together for me. So we're going to start with the early modern English period, 1500 to 1700. In this period, strong religious belief was a factor of life. Religion was a part of everyday life. Unfortunately, religious persecution was also a big part of life at this time, whether you were a Roman Catholic or whether you were a Methodist or Jewish. People were living and dying for their beliefs. Entertainment in this period was often, to our eyes, much more crude and may have even seemed cruel, with things like bear baiting taking place. Bear baiting was when you would pay a penny to go to the theatre and you'd watch a bear that was tied up be attacked by dogs, but there were loads of similar types of things. We had capital punishment in place. In other words, actually chopping people's heads off and doing even worse to them, usually if they're suspected of being a traitor or something, as well as these humiliating public punishments. You've probably heard of people being put in the stocks before. What did the average person believe is kind of hard to say exactly, but apart from religion, there was a belief in the monarchy and the divine right of kings, the idea that all power would spring from there, that the monarch was a direct line from God, and that they were able to use their subjects like chess pieces. Basically, this was not a democratic society as we would understand it now. There was a strong sense of hierarchy, a social hierarchy with deference and respect shown to those above. The aristocracy at the top, they were born into wealth, born into their titles. Then nobles, then you've got the rising middle classes beneath. At the very bottom, you've got the working classes and then peasants below them. To sum up, this was an age of deference. This is the phrase that I think we should use when we try to describe that way that people have to show respect for their superiors. This was also the start of the British Empire. It wasn't called as such yet, that happened a lot later. But it meant we started trading with other countries, and our first encounters with people led us to believe we were superior. We had condescending attitudes towards other more primitive peoples. I put that in inverted commas there. Notoriously, the slave trade starts in this period as well, which you can't really describe as anything other than dehumanising other human beings. So, with the Americas, that's North and South America, with the West Indies and Africa, we have the three countries most associated with the trade of slaves, and there was a kind of slave triangle where people would trade slaves between the countries there, and people in the UK, Britain, and people in the US would be making a lot of money off the back of this as well. The language itself is undergoing a bit of a change, so at this time we start to see English seen as a respectable language. Where before Latin, the language spoken in ancient Rome, had been the academic language. Now we have French and Latin borrowings as a way of showing off that you're well-travelled and educated. But at the same time, people are starting to see the English language as something respectable. And this led us to all sorts of interesting perspectives about English. I'm going to play you a clip now from Melvin Bragg's programme The Story of English, in which he talks about how many foreign words we borrowed and how they were seen.
The decade on either side of the year 1600 saw thousands of Latin words come into the English vocabulary of educated people. Words like excavate, horrid, radius, cautionary, pathetic, pungent, frugal, dislocate, submerged, antipathy, premium, specimen, and even the words manuscript and lexicon were absorbed into English during these 2 decades. Latin and Greek were the perfect building blocks for a new English vocabulary to describe the new concepts, techniques, and inventions that were coming in from continental Europe during the Renaissance. This was a period of great intellectual and scientific fervour. During this time were invented both the ideas and the words for atmosphere, chaos, critic, strenuous, and explain, along with the other Latin and Greek-inspired words such as paradox, eternal, and chronology. In fact, concepts and inventions are themselves words borrowed from Latin, and technique is of Greek origin. The developing field of medicine particularly relied on classical words. Still today, medical terms are in Latin and Greek, and many date from the Renaissance. Amongst the words that arrived at that time from Greek via Latin were skeleton, tendon, tibia, larynx, glottis, pancreas, and sinuses. From Latin, we also inherit our temperature, along with the parasites and viruses, the attacks of pneumonia, delirium, and epilepsy that plague our health. Even our thermometers, tonics, and capsules to cure them are all words of classical origin.
This led us to something called the inkhorn debate. This is this idea that some people believe we should stick to a pure English, free from Latin and French influence, instead of using all those long, pretentious, inky words or inkhorn words that people use to show off their education and how well travelled they are. Now, some of you might have seen the sitcom Blackadder before. It's really brilliant. It sort of romps through history with this main character, Blackadder, having all sorts of adventures. And in this episode, probably one of the most famous episodes for an English teacher, he meets Dr. Johnson, who's the author, as you'll know, of the 1755 Dictionary of English. Now, in this scene, Blackadder mischievously pretends that there's loads of words that Dr. Johnson has forgotten to put in his recently published dictionary and kind of winds him up. But I'm showing it to you because I think, note that in the sketch, it's interesting that the made-up words that Blackadder uses have this Latinate feel to them, and thus they sound much more convincing to poor old Dr. Johnson.
Enter!
Dr. Johnson, Your Highness.
Ah, Dr. Johnson. Damn cold day.
Indeed it is, sir, but a very fine one. For I celebrated last night the encyclopedic implementation of my premeditated orchestration of demotic Anglo-Saxon.
No, didn't catch any of that.
Well, I simply observed, sir, that I'm felicitous, since during the course of the penultimate solar sojourn, I terminated my uninterrupted categorization of the vocabulary of our post-Norman tongue.
Oh, I don't know what you're talking about, but it sounds damn saucy, you lucky thing. I know some fairly liberal-minded girls, but I've never penultimated any of them in that solar sojourn. Or for that matter, been given any Norman tongue.
I believe, sir, that the doctor is trying to tell you that he is happy because he has finished his book. It has apparently taken him 10 years.
Yes, well, I'm a slow reader myself.
Here it is, sir, the very cornerstone of English scholarship. This book, sir, contains every word in our beloved language.
Every single one, sir?
Every single word, sir.
Oh, well, in that case, sir, I hope you will not object if I also offer the doctor my most enthusiastic contrafibularities. What? Contrafibularities, sir? It is a common word down our way. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I'm anaspeptic, phrasmotic, even compunctious to have caused you such pericombobulation.
What are you all about, Blackadder? This is all beginning to sound a bit like Dago talk to me.
I'm sorry, sir. I merely wished to congratulate the doctor on not having left out a single word. Shall I fetch the tea, Your Highness?
Yes, and get that damn fire up here, will you?
Certainly, sir. I shall return interphrastically.
Right, on to other historical factors. We have, in 1611, the King James Bible published. Now, the King James Bible is the most famous single English language translation of the Bible. And it meant that people were able to have access in big numbers to this book in English, as opposed to having to, say, hear a preacher read from it or translate it for them. And so loads of the expressions from this have entered into everyday use. I'll give you a couple. We have bite the dust, the haves and the have-nots, the expression baptism of fire, phrases like the blind leading the blind. They are all from the King James Bible, and so it just goes to show you how something published over 400 years ago can really influence the way that people still speak today. When we talk about the role of women in this time, it's very complicated and it's hard to really unpick much beyond the fact that women had lots of negative stereotypes in this patriarchal society. So patriarchal as in men were dominating it in every possible aspect. So women were seen, we know, as the weaker sex. They could not enter professions such as law and medicine, politics. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't have some influence, though there were some female writers, there were female painters, female playwrights. But many women became cooks or maids because there wasn't really that option for them then. And so, I think when you look at a text that's written by or that's written about a female, you have to think, what exactly were the options available to them and how did people by and large see women? Okay, those aren't the only negative stereotypes. If you read Shakespeare plays, you'll know that there were certain stereotypes that women were more lustful than men and kind of couldn't control their appetites, which is kind of interesting, isn't it, considering that's sort of flipped now. But they're, I suppose, the key ones that you might want to know about. Which brings us round to the topic of marriage. Marriage was seen as for life, a lifelong commitment, and there was no Beyonce in that time to celebrate the single ladies. Single women were often seen with pity or seen as a kind of burden to society. At the very worst, single women may have actually been accused of being witches. The idea of witches was actually a belief held even by King James I himself. So yeah, it seems in terms of beliefs a very superstitious age to us. The picture you see here illustrates the 4 humours that were believed to underlie every human. The belief was that we had these 4 fluids inside us, phlegm, sanguine, bile and choler, and if you had an imbalance of those, then it could lead to personality disorders, I suppose. So basically, when you're reading these texts, think about to what extent do you feel that these beliefs reflect something that would to us seem superstitious or based on not scientific facts but what was then seen to be science. So we'll move on to the next period of English, the modern English period, which runs from 1700 to 1900. Now, don't think that religion is going to disappear. It was still a key part of people's lives and would be right up until the near present. But you will probably see its influence wane if you get a text from, say, the 1800s, right? Especially towards the end of that period. We also had the publication of Johnson's Dictionary, which we've mentioned before, in 1755. This was the first dictionary to really take the definitions of words and alongside them give us examples of how they were first used. So that meant that people could see the history of English evolving. We see the growth of the novel as a genre. So if you think about what the novel is, it allows you to get an insight into a character's inner life in a way that, say, a play doesn't. So we had plays, but this was something that showed a new interest in people's inner lives. And one pattern that you see as you go through this period is we become more introspective, more interested in people's thoughts and motivations. In terms of literacy, we see both male and female literacy rising in this period. So by the 1880s, schools had to educate 5 to 10-year-olds, and that meant all schools, meaning that we had a general literacy level. Women begin campaigning for the vote in the 1800s.
Women should not exercise judgment in political affairs.
If we allow women to vote, it will mean the loss of social structure.
Vote for women! Fight for women! Vote for women!
Slavery is abolished in the UK by an act in 1833. That doesn't mean the British Empire comes to an end. In fact, it continues, and up until the early 1900s, there were lots of countries that we were either protectors of or that were part of the Commonwealth. In terms of technology and the way that affects us, we had at this time a thing called the Industrial Revolution. This meant that we saw lots of working class people working in factories or on production lines, often in terrible conditions. We had children in this period working alongside adults too. Talking of children, this was a period that we often romanticised, as in books like Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, but really the genre of children's literature is established in this period. It seems crazy, doesn't it, that we were both romanticising it, but also at the same time children were still being treated as little adults at this period and working like them.
Please, Mr. Dodgson, just once more. Yes, please tell us that story again. Yes, do.
That's all till next time.
Ah, but it is next time.
That's enough till we've landed and had our tea. Steer over there, please, Miss Alice. There's our picnic spot.
Oh, lovely.
So, kind of coming back to religion in a way here, science and religion start to butt heads. We have Darwin writing his famous book, The Origin of Species, which was chiefly a challenge to the theory that the world was created by God in 7 days, instead replacing it with this theory that came to be known as the theory of evolution, or he called it then the theory of natural selection. We get the first complaints about writing here. We see prescriptivists seeking to establish the English language that they want to see, and they kind of part company from the actual facts in cases at times. We get people who try to come up with new crazy spelling systems that they believe will solve the problem of the fact that English has, for example, so many different ways to pronounce words that end O-U-G-H. If you take a moment to think about it, you realise we have words like rough and tough, which use an uff sound, words like bow, with that ow sound, B-O-U-G-H, and then we have cough, C-O-U-G-H as well. And there seems to be no logic to it. So people tried to come up with spelling systems that would try to prevent English being so irrational. But as you can see from the fact that we're still using these, they didn't work. And sticking with technology, we had our first photographs taken in the late 1800s. It wasn't a big commercial venture at that point like it is nowadays, and there was no Instagram, but it gave us a glimpse into a way of recording the world that we had never had before. So kind of people would rely on portraits and things like that. And sticking with technology, we have the beginning of train travel, which means, in practical terms, that even working class people can now see parts of England that they had never seen or could have hoped of seeing before. With that comes complaints about train travel too, the quality of the ride, the way that it was destroying the countryside, that kind of thing. We almost have the beginnings of an environmental movement in the reaction to trains. And that takes us to our next period, the 1900 to 2000 period, which we call late modern English. In this period, we see the first real waning of religious belief. As we become a more multicultural society, many still cling to that belief that Britain is a Christian society primarily. We have the first flight across the Atlantic. So think about how incredible it must have been to think that you could actually take to the skies like a bird in the early 1900s, and how unthinkable that would have been. We have the decriminalisation of homosexuality in the 1960s in the UK as well. So have a listen to this presenter here talking about homosexuality in the 1960s. I think it's from 1964.
In Britain alone, there are at least 1 million men and 1 million women who are homosexual. Now, for some reason, the law takes an entirely different attitude toward the two sexes in this matter. Between women, homosexuality is perfectly legal, but between men, it's a crime, rendering the offender liable to several years of imprisonment. There are only half a dozen countries in the world in which it is a crime, but for some reason, Britain is one of them. So what's it like, then, to be a male homosexual in Britain today, whose only choice is between a lifetime of complete sexual abstinence or being a criminal?
And then in 1967, we have the Sexual Offences Act, which decriminalises homosexual acts effectively. It doesn't mean that stigma, that homophobia disappeared, not at all, but it does signal a change in the official attitudes towards it. Then in 1918, women are first given the vote, some women, not all women here, and in 1928 we see all women getting the vote, in line with men for the first time.
A woman shall be entitled to be registered as a parliamentary elector for a constituency if she has attained the age of 30 years. Now, this is quite an important point. Even though women were finally given the vote, they had to be over the age of 30, which isn't quite fair, as men could do it from 21. 10 years later, in 1928, women finally got to vote at 21. At last, women were political equals to men.
We have the first cars becoming widely available, to the extent that, I was quite surprised by this figure actually, that 1 million cars were on the roads of Britain by 1930. I cannot imagine how much that must have revolutionised the person who was wealthy enough to have one's ability to get around the country. Language itself becomes a bit more flexible in this period. We have some interesting language changes here. We get things like blends. So brunch for breakfast and lunch, and motel for motor and hotel, a hotel that you might drive to. We get things like the first abbreviations that are initialisms, that are acronyms, okay? So, initialisms like BBC, acronyms like NATO. These things just didn't really exist in the previous periods. Towards the end of the period, the internet is invented, which seems unthinkable now that it could not exist at some point. But in 1983, a limited version was invented only to be used in general, by the general public, that is, by the 1990s. Mobile phones came about at the same time, so they are in general use from the 1990s. This meant that people could start communicating via text message, and you'll know from the 21st century English bit of the course, that this meant that language itself changed to reflect it in the way that people abbreviated things, first of all to fit onto the standard message length of 140 characters. And that takes us to the present day English period, which runs from 2000 to the present day. And the 21st century language that we use now reflects all the changes that have happened up to this point. We see a lot of the way that we change in our communication reflects the fact that we need to be there right away, responding quickly, the speed and the urgency of communication. But also, there are some interesting innovations here, like emojis that become a regular part of the English vocabulary. I've got a good clip here with Jack Whitehall talking about emojis and how the context of them changes what is said in words.
My dad, okay, he's in his 70s. The other day, right, apropos of nothing, he starts using emoticons in his text messages. The problem is, he doesn't know what any of them mean, so he just throws them in willy-nilly with complete disregard. Now, as we all know, the major issue with an emoticon, right, is it can give a text message a completely different context, all right? The other day, oh my God, he sent me a text message which should have been a perfectly innocent thing to receive. It turned out to be the most harrowing thing I have ever read in my entire life. It went like this. Dear Jack, are you coming over for Sunday lunch? Your sister's gonna be there. Winky face. What's your plan? Hashtag family roast.
Phrases like this, fake news, come about thanks to Trump. I've got a clip of him using this phrase here. Fake news, by the way, is the idea that particularly right-wing speakers and commentators don't like the mainstream media that critiques them, and so they decide to call it out as fake.
Give us a chance to ask a question, sir.
Go ahead.
Sir, can you state, Mr. President-elect,
go ahead.
Can you state categorically,
she's asking a question. Don't
Mr. President-elect, can you give us a question?
Don't be
You're
rude.
attacking us. Can you give us a question?
Don't be rude.
Can you
No,
give
I'm
us
not
a
going to give you a
question?
question. I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you state categorically?
You are fake news.
Sir,
go ahead.
Can you state categorically that nobody... No.
Twitter and Facebook were both created in this period. At first, they had character limits on that provided restrictions and meant that people had to be creative with them. That's less true now, but it was originally true. And we see the first internet memes created as well. Overall, I suppose I would say that the purpose of this video is for you to be careful with using context. Not to assume that because something's from the early modern English period, it equals the writer must be religious, or that because the writer is female, that she must be working in a domestic job or something, if it's in the modern English period. That's not the point at all. The point is to make you think, well, there were certain norms and expectations, and it's interesting sometimes to know about those so that you can comment on how they might be reflected in the language. So I'm going to kind of repeat that point in a different way. So now let's imagine you're sitting there with the essay in front of you and you're quoting from a writer and you want to bring the context in. What you would do is think about what the writer said and how could that reflect the context. Is there any way the things I've just taught you or told you about are reflected in what the writer themselves said? So my message is really, be careful with context. Don't over-assume that the writer follows some stereotypical pattern. Just have it there in the background as an awareness when you're making your point.
I'm rambling, man.
And you're going to keep on rambling.
Oh, yes.